He thought he had erased a life with a single sentence, but he was about to face something that couldn't be undone. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments below, and if you believe dignity matters more than power, stay with this story. Now, back to Victor Hale. The room smelled faintly of leather and expensive cologne, the kind that lingered long after conversations ended, the kind that made people lower their voices without being told. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the Manhattan skyline in late afternoon gold, but inside the office, the light felt colder, sharper, like it belonged to him. Victor Hale stood behind his desk, one hand resting against polished mahogany, the other slipping casually into the pocket of his tailored charcoal suit. 6'2", broad shoulders, every movement precise, controlled. He was a man who didn't raise his voice because he never had to. Around him, silence wasn't just respect. It was survival. Amara Johnson stood near the doorway, hands folded in front of her, eyes lowered but steady. She had learned quickly in this house. Move quietly, speak less, never draw attention. Invisible meant safe. Invisible meant she could keep sending money back home, keep the lights on for her younger brother in Atlanta, keep her life stitched together one careful step at a time. But today, invisibility felt fragile, like glass about to crack. Victor didn't look at her at first. He glanced at a document, flipped a page, then finally lifted his eyes, sharp, assessing, the kind that made people feel seen and judged in the same breath. "I don't want a child," he said, his voice calm, almost bored, like he was discussing an unwanted business expense. No one in the room moved. Not the two men standing by the wall. Not the assistant near the door. Even the city outside seemed to pause. Then came the sentence that would echo long after it was spoken. "Get rid of it." The words didn't rise. They didn't strike. They simply landed. Heavy, final. Amara's fingers tightened slightly against each other, a movement so small it could have been missed by anyone who wasn't watching closely. But Victor noticed everything. He always did. Her throat felt dry, but she didn't speak right away. She had practiced silence like a second language. But silence, today, felt louder than any protest. "Yes, sir," she said softly. 2 words. Obedience wrapped in calm. But her eyes, when she lifted them just slightly, held something different. Not defiance. Not fear. Something quieter. Something that didn't bend. Victor studied her for a moment longer than necessary, as if trying to place that feeling, as if trying to understand why those 2 simple words didn't sound like surrender. Then he looked away. Decision made. Case closed. That was how his world worked. Problems appeared. He removed them. Efficient. Clean. Final. Outside, a siren wailed faintly in the distance. Inside, the silence returned, thicker now, heavier. Amara stepped back, 1 foot at a time, careful, controlled, just like she had always been. But as she turned toward the hallway, her hand moved instinctively, almost unconsciously, resting for a brief second against her abdomen. A gesture no one acknowledged. A gesture no one questioned. A gesture that, in that moment, carried more weight than every word spoken in that room. And behind her, Victor Hale had already moved on to the next page, unaware that the life he thought he had just erased was already beginning to fight back in silence. The hallway outside Victor Hale's office felt longer than it had that morning. The marble floors colder beneath Amara Johnson's worn shoes as each step echoed just a little too loudly in her ears, as if the mansion itself had heard the words and was still holding on to them. She kept her gaze forward, shoulders steady, breathing measured, because in this house even the smallest crack in composure could be noticed, could be remembered, and memory here had consequences. The staff passed her, quietly, some offering polite nods, others avoiding eye contact altogether, because everyone understood the unspoken rule that survival depended on knowing when not to ask questions. And today there was something in the air, something heavy, like a storm that had already passed but left the sky unsettled. She reached the service corridor, the part of the mansion that no guest ever saw, where polished marble gave way to dull tile and crystal chandeliers were replaced by humming fluorescent lights. And only then did her pace slow, just slightly, just enough for her hand to rise again, resting against her abdomen, as if confirming something only she could feel. Her reflection in the narrow utility mirror looked the same as always, dark eyes calm, expression composed, uniform neat, But beneath that stillness was a quiet war that had already begun. Hours passed in routine, dishes washed, linens folded, surfaces cleaned until they gleamed, and she performed each task with the same precision she always had, because routine was safety, and safety was everything. Yet every now and then her mind returned to those words, not louder, not sharper, but heavier, settling into her chest like something that refused to leave. By the time evening settled over the city and the mansion lights dimmed into a softer glow, Amara had retreated to her small room. Tucked near the back staircase, a space barely large enough for a narrow bed, a dresser, and a single window that faced the brick wall of the neighboring building. It was not much, but it was hers, and for months it had been enough. She closed the door gently behind her, leaning against it for a moment as the quiet finally wrapped around her fully. No footsteps, no voices, no expectations, just silence. The kind of silence that did not demand anything, the kind that allowed truth to surface. She sat at the edge of the bed, hands resting in her lap before slowly moving again, instinctively, protectively, and this time she did not pull them away. The city outside hummed faintly, distant traffic, a siren somewhere far off, life continuing as if nothing had changed, but inside that small room everything had. She thought about the path in front of her, not in dramatic flashes, not in fear, but in quiet calculation. Because she had lived her whole life learning how to survive without breaking, how to carry weight without letting it show, how to endure without asking for anything in return. There would be no conversations, no explanations, no one coming to guide her through what came next, and yet the decision did not arrive as a sudden realization. It had already been there, forming the moment those words were spoken. Her shoulders straightened slightly, her breathing steadied, and something within her settled into place, not loud, not defiant, but unshakable. Across the city, high above the streets, Victor Hale stood by his office window once more, glass of amber liquid untouched in his hand as he stared out at the skyline, already moving on to other matters, other decisions, other lives to control, unaware that in a small room far below the world he ruled, a quiet choice had just been made, one that did not seek his approval, one that did not fear his power, one that would not disappear simply because he had said it should. The next morning arrived without announcement, slipping through the narrow gap between the curtains in Amara Johnson's room as a thin line of pale light that traced across the floor and stopped just short of her bed, as if even the sun hesitated to cross fully into her space. She was already awake, not because she had slept well, but because sleep had come in fragments, brief moments of rest interrupted by thoughts she could not silence, not loud or chaotic, but steady, persistent, like a quiet voice asking the same question over and over again until it no longer needed to be spoken. She sat up slowly, her movements careful, deliberate, the same way she approached everything in her life, as if rushing would somehow break the fragile balance she had learned to maintain. Her uniform hung neatly on the chair beside her, pressed the night before, ready for another day that would look identical to the last on the surface. Yet beneath it, everything had shifted. She dressed without hesitation, smoothing the fabric down, tying her hair back, and when she looked into the small mirror again, there was no visible difference, no sign of the decision that had taken root inside her, no evidence of the weight she now carried beyond what anyone else could see. Downstairs, the mansion moved with its usual rhythm, breakfast prepared with precision, coffee brewed exactly the way it was expected, voices low, footsteps measured, a world that operated on control and predictability, and Amara stepped into it seamlessly, performing her role with the same quiet efficiency that had made her invisible from the beginning. But invisibility now felt different, not like protection, but like distance, as if she had already begun to step away from a life that no longer belonged to her. In the kitchen, another staff member spoke briefly about a delivery schedule, something routine, something forgettable, and Amara nodded politely, responding. Where necessary, her voice steady, her expression calm, giving nothing away. Upstairs, Victor Hale moved through his morning with the same precision that defined everything he did, his schedule mapped out to the minute, meetings lined up, decisions waiting to be made, and yet something small, almost imperceptible, lingered at the edge of his awareness, not a thought, not a memory, but a pause, like a word he could not quite recall. He dismissed it quickly, because hesitation had no place in his world, and he had built everything he had by never looking back once a decision was made. Hours passed, and by late afternoon the sky had shifted into a muted gray, the kind that made the city feel heavier, quieter, and in that quiet, Amara returned to her room earlier than usual, closing the door behind her with the same care as always. She stood there for a moment, listening to the faint hum of the building, then moved with purpose, opening the small drawer beside her bed and pulling out an envelope, worn at the edges, containing what little savings she had managed to gather over months of careful living. She counted it once, then again, not because she doubted the amount, but because counting made it real, made the next step unavoidable. Her phone sat on the dresser, and after a brief pause she picked it up, scrolling through contacts until she found the one she needed, her thumb hovering for a second before pressing call. The line rang twice before a woman's voice answered, warm, but tired, the sound of someone who had seen too much and still chose to care. Amara's voice was soft, but it did not tremble as she spoke, asking for an appointment, asking for information, asking what her options were. There was no mention of fear, no hesitation in her tone, only clarity, only direction. When the call ended, she set the phone down gently, her hand once again finding its way to her abdomen, resting there longer this time, not as a question, not as uncertainty, but as confirmation. Outside, the city continued its endless motion, unaware that in a small room tucked away from view, a woman had just taken the first step toward a future that no one had planned for her, and far above, in a world of glass and power, a man who believed every outcome could be controlled remained completely unaware that something beyond his reach had already begun to unfold. The following days unfolded with a quiet precision that made everything feel almost unreal, as if the world had chosen to continue exactly as before, while something irreversible had already been set in motion beneath the surface. Amara Johnson moved through her routines with the same calm efficiency, rising before sunrise, preparing rooms, polishing surfaces that reflected lives far removed from her own. Yet each action now carried a different weight, not heavier in appearance, but deeper in meaning, because every step she took inside that mansion was no longer permanent. It was temporary, measured, part of an ending she had already accepted. The appointment she had scheduled came 2 days later, on a gray morning when the air felt thick and the city seemed slower than usual, and she left the mansion quietly, using the side entrance as she always did. Her coat pulled close against the chill as she stepped onto the sidewalk, blending into the flow of people who passed without noticing her, because invisibility in the outside world was just as natural to her as it was inside those walls. The clinic was modest, tucked between a laundromat and a small grocery store, the kind of place people walked past without a second glance, and inside it smelled faintly of antiseptic and warm coffee, a strange mix of clinical order and human effort to make things feel less cold. The woman at the front desk greeted her with a practiced kindness, not intrusive, not overly warm, just enough to make space for whatever. Story walked through the door, and Amara gave her name softly, her voice steady, her posture composed. She sat in the waiting area with her hands folded in her lap, watching the muted television mounted on the wall, though she did not follow what it showed, her thoughts moving instead through quiet calculations, not about fear, not about regret, but about what it would take to move forward, how much she could afford, where she could go, how she would rebuild a life that no longer fit within the walls she had been living in. When her name was called, she stood immediately, following the nurse down a narrow hallway into a small room where the light was softer, less harsh, and the world seemed to narrow into something more personal, more real. The conversation that followed was calm, factual, filled with options explained in measured tones, timelines, possibilities, outcomes, all laid out with professional care. And Amara listened without interrupting, absorbing each word, each implication, her expression unchanged, her eyes steady, as if she were not being told what could happen, but confirming what she already knew. When the nurse finished, there was a pause, a space left intentionally open, the kind of silence that invited a decision, and Amara's gaze lowered briefly, not in doubt, but in reflection, her hand once again resting gently against her abdomen. a gesture that had become instinctive. Grounding, real? I understand, she said quietly, her voice carrying a clarity that did not need to be raised. And then, after a breath that seemed to settle everything into place, she added, I am keeping them. The word them hanging in the air for just a fraction of a second before the nurse's expression shifted, not in surprise, but in recognition, as if she had heard this kind of certainty before, the kind that did not come from impulse, but from something deeper, something that could not be undone once spoken. Outside, the city moved on as it always did, cars passing, people rushing, lives intersecting without pause, and inside that small room, a decision had just been made that would reshape everything, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a quiet strength that did not need validation. Back at the mansion, Victor Hale signed documents, took calls, gave instructions, his world continuing in perfect order, unaware that far from his reach, beyond his control, a path had been chosen that no command of his could reverse, and that somewhere in the city, the life he had dismissed without a second thought had just been given not only a chance, but a future multiplied beyond anything he had imagined. Amara Johnson returned to the mansion that evening with the same quiet footsteps, the same composed expression, but something within her had shifted from uncertainty into direction, and once a direction is chosen, even the smallest movements begin to carry intention. The sky outside had turned a deep blue, the city lights flickering on one by one like distant signals, while inside the estate everything remained untouched by change. The marble floors polished, the air controlled, the rhythm of power uninterrupted, and yet Amara moved through it now as someone already halfway gone, someone who understood that this place was no longer where her story would continue. She completed her tasks with precision, finishing later than usual, making sure nothing was left undone, because leaving things incomplete was not in her nature, not even now, not even when everything inside her was preparing for departure. In the laundry room, she folded the last set of linens slowly, smoothing each corner, as if memorizing the motion, as if grounding herself in something familiar before stepping into the unknown. And when she finally placed them aside, her hands lingered for just a second longer than necessary before pulling away. Upstairs, Victor Hale stood in his study reviewing numbers on a screen, his mind moving quickly through decisions that affected industries, investments, entire networks of influence. Yet beneath that constant control there was a faint distraction, subtle but persistent, like a thread out of place in an otherwise perfect design, and though he could not name it, he found himself glancing once toward the door, as if expecting something that did not come. Later that night, Amara returned to her room and opened the small closet, her belongings few enough to pack into a single suitcase, clothes neatly folded, essentials carefully arranged, every item chosen not for comfort but for necessity, because she knew there would be no room for excess in the life ahead. She moved with quiet efficiency, not rushing, not hesitating, each motion deliberate, each decision final, and when the suitcase was closed, the sound was soft but absolute. Like the end of a chapter that would not reopen, she sat on the edge of the bed for a moment, the room dimly lit by a single lamp, and allowed herself one breath that carried everything she was leaving behind, the stability, the familiarity, the illusion of safety. And then she stood, lifting the suitcase with steady hands, her posture straight, her gaze forward. The hallway outside was empty, the house silent in that late hour when even the powerful slept, and she walked through it without looking back, her steps light but unwavering, until she reached the service exit and paused, her hand resting briefly against the door. For a fraction of a second, the world seemed to hold still, as if offering her one last chance to turn around, to return to what she knew, to choose the easier path. But she did not move, because some decisions, once made, do not allow for retreat. She opened the door and stepped into the cool night air, the city stretching before her vast and indifferent, full of uncertainty and possibility in equal measure, and behind her, the door closed with a quiet click that echoed more deeply than any noise. Above, in his high office, Victor Hale remained unaware, the lights of his study still burning as he worked late into the night, believing everything within his world remained under control. unaware that the one person he had dismissed without a second thought had just walked out of his reach entirely, carrying with her a future that no longer belonged to him, a future that was growing, unseen, unstoppable, and already beyond anything he could command. The city did not welcome Amara Johnson with open arms. It simply continued as it always had, indifferent to who arrived and who disappeared, and that indifference became her first test, the apartment she found was small, barely 400 square feet, tucked above a corner store that stayed open late into the night, the faint hum of refrigerators and distant traffic becoming the background to a life she was now building from nothing but choice and necessity. The walls were thin, the paint slightly worn, and the window looked out onto a narrow alley where sunlight only reached for a few hours each day. But when she stepped inside and set her single suitcase down, there was something else. There too, something unfamiliar yet steady, the quiet presence of ownership, of a space that did not belong to anyone else's rules. The first nights were the hardest, not because of fear, but because of silence that no longer needed to be controlled, silence that allowed every thought to rise without interruption. And in that silence, Amara lay awake more than she slept, her hand resting where it had begun to return again and again, not out of worry, but out of awareness, as if she was learning to listen to something that had not yet found its voice. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, and time moved in a rhythm entirely different from the one she had known inside the mansion. There were no fixed schedules handed to her, no expectations shaped by someone else's needs, only the steady demand of survival, rent to be paid, food to be managed, energy to be conserved, and she adapted the only way she knew how, with discipline, with restraint, with a quiet resilience that did not draw attention but never faltered. She found work wherever she could, cleaning offices in the early mornings, helping at a small diner in the afternoons, tasks that required no questions, no explanations, only effort. And though the hours were long and the pay modest, there was a dignity in it that no one could take away, because every dollar she earned now carried a purpose that belonged entirely to her. As her body changed, slowly, undeniably, she adjusted without complaint, moving more carefully, pacing herself, learning the limits and strengths of what she carried. And there were moments, brief but real, when she would pause in the middle of her day, standing still among strangers, her hand resting gently as she allowed herself to feel it. Not fear, not doubt, but a quiet connection that grew stronger with time. Across the city, Victor Hale continued his life untouched by visible consequence. His days filled with decisions that shaped outcomes for others. His nights lit by the glow of screens and city lights stretching endlessly beyond his windows. Yet that faint thread of distraction had not disappeared. It lingered in small, unexplainable ways, in the brief pause before signing a document, in the momentary silence after a conversation ended, in the rare instances when his thoughts drifted without direction, something he did not allow, something he could not easily control. He dismissed it each time, because there was no place in his world for uncertainty, and whatever had been set in motion months ago had, in his mind, already been resolved, already been removed, but far from his reach. In a place where power held no influence, Amara Johnson continued forward without asking for anything, without expecting anything, carrying not just one life, but something more, something still unseen, still unfolding, something that would soon reshape the meaning of every choice that had been made. And though no one around her knew it yet, the quiet strength she carried was growing, steady and undeniable, preparing to reveal a truth that no command could erase and no distance could keep hidden forever. Winter arrived slowly, not with a single storm, but with a quiet shift in the air, a sharpness that settled into the streets and crept through the thin walls of Amara Johnson's apartment, reminding her with each passing day that time had moved forward whether she was ready or not. The small space she lived in had changed too, not in size or structure, but in presence, as if the air itself carried more weight now, more life, more responsibility, and she adjusted to it with the same quiet discipline that had carried her through every stage of her journey. Mornings began earlier, her movements slower but more intentional, every action measured not just for efficiency, but for endurance, because her body now asked for more, demanded more, and she gave without complaint. At the diner, the manager had started assigning her shorter shifts, not out of generosity but practicality, and though the reduced hours meant less income, Amara accepted it without argument, finding ways to compensate elsewhere, taking on small cleaning jobs in nearby offices, stretching every dollar, every ounce of energy, because stopping was not an option. There were moments, brief and unspoken, when strangers would glance at her with curiosity or quiet judgment, noticing the change in her form, the way she carried herself, and she met those looks with calm indifference, neither inviting nor rejecting them, simply continuing forward as if their opinions had no place in her world. One afternoon, as she sat in a small clinic room for a routine check, the soft hum of equipment filling the space, the nurse paused longer than usual, her expression shifting from routine observation to something more attentive, more focused. And when she spoke, her tone carried a careful clarity that made the air feel suddenly still. There was more than one heartbeat, she explained, her words measured, deliberate, as if choosing them carefully would somehow soften their impact. And for a moment, Amara did not react, not because she did not understand, but because she was allowing the meaning to settle fully, completely, without resistance. 3. The nurse said gently, confirming what the monitor had already revealed, and the room fell into a quiet that was not empty, but full, heavy with implication, with challenge, with a future that had just expanded beyond anything she had prepared for. Amara's hand moved instinctively, resting where it always had, but this time her fingers pressed slightly firmer, grounding herself in the reality of what she had just been told. And though her breath slowed, her expression did not break, did not show fear, did not show doubt, only a deeper stillness, as if something within her had shifted once again, not away from the path she had chosen, but further into it. Across the city, Victor Hale stood in a boardroom surrounded by voices discussing numbers, projections, outcomes, yet even as he listened, his mind drifted for a fraction of a second, an unfamiliar interruption that left him momentarily detached from the conversation. And though he returned quickly, regaining control as he always did, the interruption lingered just long enough to leave a trace, a quiet unease he could not define. Back in that small clinic room, Amara Johnson lifted her gaze and met the nurse's eyes with calm certainty. No hesitation, no request for alternatives, no search for reassurance. Only acceptance shaped into resolve, because what had just been revealed was not a burden she could reject, but a reality she would carry, fully and without compromise. And in that moment, without raising her voice, without making a declaration, she chose again, reaffirming a decision that had already changed everything, now multiplied beyond expectation, beyond fear, beyond anything that could be undone. And the room, for just a second, seemed to recognize it, settling into a silence that felt almost like respect. Spring did not arrive all at once. It crept into the city in fragments, a warmer breeze through narrow streets, a softer light that lingered a little longer in the afternoons, and inside a small apartment above a corner store, Amara Johnson felt time narrowing into something more immediate, more demanding. As the weeks moved faster than they had before, her steps had slowed, her routine adjusted again, no longer built around long hours or constant movement, but around preparation, endurance, and the quiet discipline of facing what was coming without retreat. The apartment had changed with her, a second-hand crib now placed near the window, folded blankets stacked carefully on a small table, 3 identical bottles lined up with precision, each detail arranged not out of abundance, but out of intention, because every item had been chosen with thought, with sacrifice, with the understanding that nothing could be wasted. The nights had grown heavier, not with fear, but with anticipation, the kind that settled into her bones and refused to let her fully rest. And yet she never complained, never allowed the weight to show beyond what was necessary, because she had long ago learned that strength was not loud, it was consistent. One evening, as the city outside moved through its usual rhythm, the sound of traffic and distant voices blending into a steady hum, Amara sat quietly by the window, her hands resting where they had so many times before, but now the feeling beneath them was unmistakable, active, alive. A reminder that what she carried was no longer just a future, it was a presence. Her breathing slowed as she focused on it, not with anxiety, but with awareness, grounding herself in the moment, in the reality that everything she had chosen had led her here, to this exact point where turning back was not only impossible, but unthinkable. Across the city, Victor Hale stood once again in his office, the skyline stretching endlessly before him. Yet tonight the view did not hold his attention the way it usually did. Something in the quiet of the room felt different, heavier, as if the space itself was waiting for something he could not name. And though his life remained unchanged on the surface, the subtle interruptions in his focus had grown more frequent, more persistent, small moments where his thoughts drifted without permission, where the control he relied on felt just slightly out of reach. He set his glass down untouched, his reflection faintly visible in the window, and for a brief second, he stood still, not calculating, not deciding, just existing in a pause that felt unfamiliar. And then, as always, he moved past it, returning to the structure that defined him, unaware that far from his world of certainty, something irreversible was about to unfold. Back in the apartment, the air seemed to shift without warning, a quiet tension settling into the room, and Amara's posture changed instantly, not in panic, but in readiness, her body recognizing what her mind had already prepared for, her hand gripping the edge of the chair as she rose slowly, carefully, her breathing controlled but deeper now, more focused. There was no one to call out to, no audience to witness what was beginning, only the small space around her, the dim light, the steady hum of the city beyond the walls. And in that solitude, she faced the moment with the same quiet strength that had carried her this far, not asking for help, not questioning what lay ahead, simply moving forward because that was what she had chosen from the beginning. Time seemed to stretch and compress all at once, each second holding more weight than the last. And though the room remained unchanged, something within it had shifted permanently, something that would soon bring 3 new voices into a world that had not been prepared for them, voices that would carry a truth too powerful to be ignored, too undeniable to be dismissed. And as the night deepened around her, the silence that filled that small apartment was no longer empty. It was waiting, holding its breath for what was about to come. Morning did not break so much as it slowly revealed what the night had carried into the world, a pale gray light slipping through the small apartment window and settling gently across the room where everything had changed, where the air itself felt fuller, heavier, alive in a way it had never been before. Amara Johnson sat quietly against the headboard, her posture exhausted but upright, her breathing slow and controlled as 3 small bundles rested close beside her, wrapped carefully in the blankets she had prepared weeks ago, their presence undeniable, their existence no longer a future but a reality that filled every inch of the space. The room was silent except for the soft, uneven rhythm of newborn breaths, fragile yet steady, 3 distinct lives beginning at once. And for a long moment, Amara did not move, did not speak. She simply looked at them, her eyes calm, her expression unchanged yet somehow deeper, as if everything she had endured, every decision she had made, had led to this single point where nothing needed to be explained anymore. Her hand moved slowly, gently adjusting one of the blankets, then another, the motion careful, instinctive, not rushed, not uncertain, just present, fully aware of what she now carried not within her, but beside her. Across the city, Victor Hale stepped into his office as he had done countless mornings before, the same tailored suit, the same controlled pace, the same expectation that the world would move according to his decisions. Yet today something felt different. The moment he crossed the threshold, something subtle but impossible to ignore, as if the space itself held a quiet tension waiting to be acknowledged. His assistant approached with the usual updates, meetings, numbers, schedules, but there was one detail that did not fit, one absence that had gone unnoticed until now, and when it was mentioned, it did not arrive with urgency. Just a simple observation that the maid who had been assigned to his floor had not reported for weeks, her position quietly filled, her name already fading from routine records. Victor paused, not visibly, not in a way that would draw attention, but internally, a brief stillness that interrupted the flow of his thoughts. And for a moment, he saw her again, not clearly, not fully, just a fragment. The way she had stood in that room, The way her voice had remained calm, the way her eyes had held something he had not understood, the memory passed quickly, dismissed as irrelevant, because in his world, anything that did not serve a purpose was left behind, and yet the faint unease remained, lingering just beneath the surface. Hours later, as the city moved through its endless cycle, Victor found himself stepping outside his usual path, his car turning down streets he rarely noticed, past buildings that held lives far removed from his own, until it slowed near a narrow block where nothing about the surroundings suggested importance. And yet something pulled his attention forward. He stepped out, the air cooler. Here, quieter, and as he moved toward the building, the sounds reached him first, soft but unmistakable, 3 separate cries blending into one fragile chorus that carried through the open window above. He stopped, his movement halting mid-step, his expression unchanged but his focus absolute, as if the world around him had narrowed into that single moment. Inside the small apartment, Amara lifted her head slightly, her gaze steady, her posture calm as she adjusted the 3rd child in her arms. Her movements precise, composed, as if nothing outside that room could disturb what she had built within it. There were no words exchanged, no confrontation, no recognition spoken aloud, only a stillness that stretched between 2 worlds that had once been connected and were now separated by something far greater than distance. Victor stood there, the sound of those 3 lives echoing in a way no command could silence, no decision could undo. And for the first time, he did not move forward, did not turn away. He simply remained where he was, facing something that did not bend to power, did not disappear when dismissed, something that existed because someone had chosen to protect it, instead of erase it. And in that quiet, without judgment, without accusation, the truth settled in its own time, undeniable, unspoken, and complete. And that day, without a single word, the world remembered what dignity looks like. In a world where power speaks louder than compassion, a ruthless mafia boss makes a cold decision that sets off an unforgettable journey of consequence, dignity, and emotional reckoning. When a quiet black maid chooses to protect life instead of obeying a command, her silent strength begins to reshape everything he thought he controlled, leading to a deeply emotional dark romance that explores the contrast between authority and humanity as she disappears into a harsh reality, building a life from nothing while carrying a truth that grows beyond expectation. The story unfolds through sacrifice, resilience, and the quiet power of motherhood, redefining what dark romance truly means when love is not spoken but proven through action. Months later, when the mafia boss is unknowingly drawn back to the life he once dismissed, he is forced to confront the undeniable presence of 3 children whose existence challenges his beliefs and exposes the limits of his control, delivering a powerful dark romance rooted in silence, consequence, and emotional transformation. This cinematic narrative blends social tension, moral conflict, and deeply human storytelling, where a black maid stands as a symbol of dignity against a world built on power, and a mafia boss learns that some decisions cannot be erased, only faced, making this dark romance not about passion alone, but about accountability, growth, and the quiet justice that unfolds when dignity is protected at all costs. With rich visual storytelling, layered emotional arcs, and a compelling exploration of class, identity, and redemption, this dark romance captures the essence of what happens when the weakest voice becomes the strongest truth, leaving behind a lasting impression of humanity, resilience, and the unspoken bond that changes everything.